So, hi there, I'm Jason Gordon, representing Aurion Learning, and welcome to this. This is the latest installment of our Learning Leaders series. Perhaps you've joined a few before. I'm delighted to be joined today by Johann Malawanna. We first met each other, what seems like a distant time ago, in the tropical climates of Dubai, whenever there was thousands of us crammed into one exhibition centre, which is these days of social isolation is a little bit different. So perhaps before we start into our conversation today, Johann, perhaps you could introduce yourself and tell us a little bit about your learning journey to date.
Sure. Thanks, Jason, for having me on. We're getting so used to now webinar technology, so we're basically this becomes our daily current. So my name's Johann Malawanna, and I've got several roles and several hats, as I think lots of people in these kind of roles do. And so I am the founder and chief executive of a company called Medics Academy. We're a company that rethinks the kind of learning journey and learning experience of senior clinicians and junior clinicians through their kind of lifetime of learning. I also founded and run an organization called the Healthcare Leadership Academy, which basically delivers leadership training for the kind of a group of clinicians across the UK and Europe, predominantly in Holland is our kind of our European site, and we take in some of the most interesting young clinicians coming out of our system, so either out of our medical schools or nursing schools, etc., but also early stage clinicians all the way up to there's a group of consultants also on the program, and they get into the program through competitive entry. It's quite a competitive process to get in, and they do a year program with us to in kind of higher skill leadership training, so doing a whole range of things from media training to various other things. And so I run those two organizations for about the last 4 years. And then outside of that, I'm also the lead for education and training for Healthcare UK, which is a government body that it sits in the Department for International Trade for the UK government, but is co-sponsored by NHS England and the Department for Health and Social Care. And what we do is we look after the external relationships of UK industry, the UK kind of business industry, with external partners, whether that's governmental partners or kind of private partners or even public partners. And so we'll support organisations in their kind of work with any kind of international partners. And so I specifically lead on education and training in healthcare for Department for International Trade, basically.
I often wonder how many days are actually in your week, Johann, the amount of hats you're wearing and the amount of roles you're doing there. You're certainly quite busy with it. So the first question. Sorry. The first question.
I think these things are always have lots of overlap, right, and they end up being interesting on lots of levels. So sorry.
They probably are interwoven, and they all help educate each other as they go. Perfect. So the first question we've been asking people is this question: what does learning that works means for you? And just to give you a bit of a background to that phrase, learning that works, is kind of part of the boilerplate of Aurion Learning and part of our DNA. And this changes from client to client. You know, for some clients, learning that works is a large scale program made up of many online modules, classroom, face-to-face sessions. For someone else, like we're seeing it at the minute, it's literally firing a 5-minute webinar onto the company extranet just to get a bit of important information out there, and that works in that context. So what does learning that works mean for you?
So I guess I mean, you know, actually Aurion is a kind of a very innovative and leading organization in the UK kind of health education market, and exactly what you're doing and what your clients need, it sounds like what it means to me, which is that the concepts around modern learning, especially given everything that's happened over the last 3-4 months, means that we absolutely need to start thinking about how professionals or even students, whoever it is, we relook at what we're doing, because I think everyone has been forced through what's happening to reevaluate what they need to do, right? What do they need to do in terms of delivering the basic services that we as a society need. And in the learning, in the education space, we're learning very quickly that much of what we knew for the last, decade, maybe 20 years, and we've had the ability to do, such as, do video conferencing technology, train people using the internet, use much more technical capabilities that are much more efficient. We're starting to, this whole pandemic has basically pushed people to totally take that up, because you just can't physically go to a university or to a professional CPD course or whatever. And actually that's really quite powerful. I mean, hopefully what comes out of this is we have a much stronger focus on the use of technology to really deliver far better learning experiences, but also just far more efficiency for any organization, whether that's society as a whole or government or an individual university or a company, a private company, because we clearly have wasted a lot of resource moving people around, and it's quite bad for the environment. There's lots of benefits that come out of this. So I think the real that statement, the learning for work statement, learning that works statement, is a really good one, a really powerful one that that many organizations are facing the reality of right now. And that's great in some ways. I mean, it's terrible because why it's happening, but what we hope is that we learn the lessons of this period and actually maybe take this forward, and hopefully things like the environmental impact and stuff like that, we can improve on that, because we've seen it work, we know it works, and now let's start using it in our everyday lives.
Yeah, I think that's one thing that we've learned through this, is there was maybe perhaps a fear or reticence, and perhaps of organizations to move online, and then all of a sudden, when the only option available is online, then hey presto, it works, and they make it work. So I think there is positives coming out of this in that angle. You touched briefly there on learning experience. Now, from our sort of industry perspective, we hear this phrase learning experience all the time. Have learning experience platforms where they're specifically geared, where the learner or the user is at the center of it, as opposed to the content being at the center of it. Now, you're a clinician by background, so you've many years of experience being the learner, and now you have many more years of experience being the teacher. So perhaps from a learner's perspective, and then perhaps from an organizational perspective, what do you feel makes a good learning experience?
I mean, I think this is where the reality of the environment we're in really comes to the fore, because we've spoken a lot over years about learner experience or user focus, or putting the individual at the focus of their experience. But actually, we're now really essentially that we're doubling down on that, right? We have to really think through what is it that someone's interacting with. One of the things I recently saw is that we at Medics Academy, we've been doing lots of partnerships with lots of other organizations, and so we tend to do partnerships with like Health Education England, or with the Tropical Health Education Trust. That's the one we've got a big conference coming up on Saturday. And what we effectively have been really thinking through is rethinking how you go to a physical event, right? So you go to a physical event, and in that event, it's not just the content on the stage, it's everything else about the experience, right? You meet people, you think about what the interaction, you're trying to talk to them, you've got lots of other reasons why you're at that event, rather than just sitting in a chair rather than watching the stage. And in lots of ways, I think the problem is that when we initially, what we're seeing is that, and I think this is where people like Aurion are really kind of, really also share many of our kind of ideas, is that you don't just shift it to online and just say, okay, well, there's the screen, just look at that. It's really thinking through those experiences. What is it about the every aspect of the experience that really makes it enjoyable? Because I think the danger is that if we simply we simply look at it in one facet, one modality, where effectively it's all just watching the screen, or in this, sitting in the audience watching the stage, I think we'll end up very quickly going back to how business was done as usual, right? Which is that you end up back once everything opens up, we'll just be like, okay, well, we don't have to use the screen anymore. We'll just fly them halfway across the world for this one-day event. And actually, what we want to see is probably for all of business and for society is not just a rush back to normality in that way, because we're learning actually as a society that there can be positives out of this, right? There isn't just negative. There are obviously terrible negatives, but the positives are that we can learn how technology can be more positive in our lives rather than negative. And in that sense, I think we have to it's really trying to use technologies that are already available. It's not about coming up with anything new. It's using what's available already and changing the experience for the user, for the person in the center of it, to focus on them, focus on how we can make the improvements. And I think, with you guys, I know that's what you guys feel passionate about as well. And I think that's a really important thing that we all should take away from this experience.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's like I said, that sort of the mix between a good organizational user learner experience, where for the organization it is about getting content or a message or information across, and getting business outcomes, getting transformation through that there, but also for the learner that they can engage with that information and they have good takeaways from it, and they enjoy that, and there's actually a willingness to start to put some of that into practice. So like you say, how do we convert that from the old way of doing things to this new way of doing things? And like you're saying, there are benefits for society, for the sustainability of the planet and everything else. So it's how do we carry those things forward? So thinking of you mentioned there in your introduction the many hats that you wear and the different organisations you work with, and obviously your past as a obstetrician and whatnot. Could you perhaps tell us about a significant challenge that you've tackled with learning?
Okay, so one of the things that our organisation is doing currently is we're really looking at the transition between being at medical school, so being a final year medical student, which is the university experience, and transitioning to clinical practice. So that's we've identified that as our kind of key focus over the next few months, because it's the key area that we think we, like Medics Academy as an organisation, can have an impact. There are so many problems currently in society, but that's the one we focus on. And as a former clinician, I know that the transition points are the most sensitive points in my career. Right, when I went from medical school to being a doctor, even when going from being a student to being a medical student, going from being a medical student to being a doctor, going from the end of foundation to starting my specialty training, all of these, and then within my specialty. So within obstetrics, there's also a major transition between a lower tier and a higher tier of experience and responsibility. And these transition points are where you feel the most out of depth and sensitive and open to traumatic experience. And so managing that is a really, and understanding that is a really important thing. So one of the things we focused on was thinking, what can we do as an organisation? And the area we knew that we can have the biggest impact was the transition from medical school to foundation. So that first clinical transition where responsibility starts hitting the clinician. So when this whole COVID situation struck, one of the things that having, over 20 years of experience or 15 to 20 years of experience in the system, was that I knew that this was something we wanted to kind of really help with and tackle. And so the team got together and we thought, the business environment is terrible, frankly. So we all, I think, are going through the same problem. If you're working in any kind of business environment, it's a terrible environment to be in. And one of the things we said as a team was, look, if anything is going to happen to our organization, then at least let's make sure we've done we go down fighting, we go down doing the thing that we passionately care about. So we actually shifted all of our emphasis, knowing that we've got a runway, a limited, period of time that we can, but we've shifted all of our emphasis onto, okay, let's solve this problem for the people that we were getting complaints from effectively, or requests from, which were these clinicians we were looking after. And so we kept hearing about how young doctors or people that were being called up, as it were, the government were using these war terminology, being called up to war, were being called up, were so nervous. And so we focused on that. And what we did is we created this transition program, and that has been incredible. In 3 weeks or 3 and a bit weeks, we've signed up 65% of all the doctors coming out of the UK medical schools. So they've signed up to the program, and we are running like essentially learning events and stuff like that. And it's been an incredible challenge. Like I say, not because of how do you, like, there are so many now webinar providers, like literally producing content. There are lots of clinicians on YouTube, whatever. But how do we focus and make what we're trying to do, like, just build on top of what other people are doing? So there's no point, and one of the things we were clear on as an organization is there's no point competing with other providers, right? So our mission has been to work with whoever's out there and work out how we can augment what they're doing and they can augment what we're doing. So we've really focused on that theory. That's been our kind of business theory anyway of what we do. And so we try and see what the best is out there, and then try and bring it together, and then see how we add that extra layer, like that experiential layer or whatever. And we found that there's just loads of people out there doing really cool stuff, and the worst thing you can do is actually try and work out how to undermine other organizations, because there's no point, because actually they're offering so much quality. What you really want to do is just kind of augment it, add it together, create an additive experience, and build it together, because actually in the end, the user, the person at the end of this, what they want is just to have the best experience. And often we're all kind of in that situation where we can work effectively together and solve specific facets of that. And that's what we've achieved. And actually, and because of that, we've created several partnerships over this very short period with other both commercial and non-commercial organizations to create really useful learning experiences for our clinicians where we wouldn't have been before, and they've got different focuses, but they kind of find that helpful. So we've really thought that through, and that's been one of the thorniest problems we've faced, is like, what do we do? You know, that point when when the lockdown happened, you had, as an organization, I think many organizations looked at that and thought, you know, what does this mean? Is this survival, basically? And I think one of the things that I found that really cool was that our team basically just thought, you know what, we're going to solve that problem, and we did, and it's been good. It's been really good.
Yeah, and if you had, I'm trying to think if you had a key takeaway for some organisations, because obviously, you know, we all joke about avoiding the hospital at certain times of year whenever the F1s are unleashed, and you know they don't know what they're doing, so we'll avoid it for a few months. You don't want to go in for surgery then, but obviously that's normally quite a slow process, and it happens gradually. Whereas at the minute with this whole scenario, like you say, they have just been called up, they've been thrown onto the front lines, to use the analogy. So there's been a process of sort of accelerated learning there from that sort of transition period that you talked about. What sort of key takeaways would you perhaps find for other organizations? You're maybe in different circumstances, but it's still that accelerated process. You know, we normally do this in 3 months, but you know what? We're doing it in a week. You know, what would be the key takeaway that you would have?
So I think I remember when being a clinician, I remember hearing this story, you know, don't be around on the 1st of August or whatever. But actually what was interesting as you know, in remembering that time was that actually, like, often the hospital as a whole there were lots of clinicians who really stepped up in that period. So like, actually in August, you ended up in this scenario where people doubled down because there were all these new, fresh, young doctors who looked like genuinely like the rabbit in the taillights, right? They were like, oh my God. And so actually, I often remember in the clinical jobs I did that period was fine, like, because everyone like was there, right? The consultants were like very aware, everyone.
Left the golf course for a few weeks.
Yeah, well, the whole theory about that. Nowadays, I mean, I don't know. I think I don't know a doctor at all that plays golf. I don't know whether they've ever done. But actually, like the NHS as a whole, what I've seen is that basically that's happening on like a massive scale, right? That I'm hearing stories from some of my clinical friends where they've just, like, they're totally doubling down in the hospitals of just making sure everyone's supported. They've got like good clinical care. So in lots of ways, it's actually patient behavior, which is quite interesting because people are totally avoiding going to hospital, which is good in lots of cases. But there's also, it means that there are periods in the hospital where it's incredibly quiet. What I'm hearing is that there are some, I mean, not in central London or in Birmingham or, in the big centres, but there's a lot of places where people are just staying at home totally. And actually what you find is that, so there's a kind of weird mix, right? Because the reality is, I think most organizations, when they take it seriously and they focus on it, that's important. And the NHS is very good at that. They're very, very, very good at emergencies, right? How do you solve an emergency, and putting in the resources and people having a sense of responsibility to step up and do something about it. And I think that if any organization wants to learn, key takeaways, certainly from the NHS, I think that's it, is that any organization, you get senior buy-in, you make sure that someone in a decision-making role is able to be there to back up your frontline staff, as well as being part of the frontline so they understand what's going on. I think that's so important, that and that's what the NHS does incredibly well, that the senior clinicians are often very, very much aware of what is going on the front line. I think where there's often a real problem is when people who are running an organization are disconnected from that front line. So anyone going through those kind of transitions, I think the important thing is to really, really double down on knowing what's going on that front line, and then ensuring that you're kind of problem solving very fast. You're kind of really dealing with issues as they come up. And I think that's certainly true in this kind of learning environment as well. I think that's really important.
It's applicable across the board, that definitely. So our next question is, what are some of the practical steps an organization can put in place to promote learning? We've come across organizations before who have perhaps invested heavily in changing the infrastructure. They've bought new platforms. They've put a lot of money into content and things like that there, but quite often they do nothing investing in the culture of the organization. So learning is still something that you do. You've nothing else to do. It's not seen as something important. And if you see a colleague sitting doing an e-learning module when the rest of you are busy, it's almost looked down upon to stay in. So what are some of the places or some of the practical steps an organization could put in place to promote learning?
I mean, I think this is common to every single occurrence, right? But how someone in a senior position lives their life is often everyone else in the organization looks to them and thinks that's what this organization believes, right? So even if the most senior person in the organization commissions large amounts of budget to be spent on learning, but then don't go through the practical steps of being seen to take it seriously, actually embedding it, doing it themselves, I think that's when you get that occurrence. You get that scenario, which is where people don't take it seriously. They've spent all this money, they don't know why it doesn't work, and then you get the kind of usual thing of, oh well, clearly it doesn't work. It's the solution is the problem, right? It's e-learning that doesn't work. Whereas actually, I think the reality is with anything in an organization, if your most senior people do not take something seriously, then you're lost, right? You have no chance of making it work. And I think the advice I'd give to any organization doing something is, if you're going to commit budget to it, money's one thing, but you also need to commit the kind of the headspace of someone who is going to be that kind of champion for the product, or champion for the change, or champion for the kind of culture shift that you're trying to kind of engender. And if they can't be seen to be that person, then you're just going to waste that money, right? And so really you need, so the organization that you're commissioning can only do so much, right? If you're Aurion, if you're going to commission Aurion to do something, you need to take it really seriously, that this is what I'm doing, because otherwise you're just, you can't rely on someone to come in and do your job for you. And culture of an organization is very much the front and center, the role of the leadership of that organization is the reality.
Those internal ambassadors that are going to carry that change forward and make a real difference. So we're thinking of this series has all been about learning leaders. So what advice would you give to someone within an organization who wants to develop, their own reputation as being a learning leader. Perhaps it'd be useful for you to give us your definition of what a learning leader actually is and what advice you would give someone who's wanting to flourish in that position.
Yeah, I mean, I guess someone who is, to me, a learning leader would be someone that is really a champion, not just for the specific information you're trying to transfer, but actually the process of embedding the concept of learning within an organization, right? That you as an organization understand that you're learning from, and this is true of everything. If you're sales orientated, you're learning from what actually works rather than just doing it because it's on a tick sheet of what this is how we've done it in the past, right? And I think that in that way, learning leaders are not necessarily like, you don't have to be the I don't know, chief education officer or what the equivalent is in any organization, the person who's the learning and development manager or whatever. It's a learning leader is very much someone who promotes, to me, is someone that's promoting that the concepts around learning, i.e. that we're learning from our own information, our own data, our own mistakes, and we're kind of improving the quality as a result of that feedback. And I think that's a really important skill and an important kind of an important role. And the reality I find is that usually people that behave like that end up being significantly more are the people that you basically go to, right? They're the people you want to interact with, and whether that's people that are more junior, but also sometimes people that are more senior and at the same level, because you want to kind of work with, I mean, I find that I always want to surround myself with people that are far better than me. Like it is so much easier doing my job if the people around me are way more intelligent, way smart, like they know what they're doing, they're really professional. If I can be the stupidest person in the room, that helps, right? Because then I'm learning off everyone else in that room, and I'm working out what's going on. I'm pushing myself, and that's what I want to be. I want to constantly be in that scenario where I'm being pushed. And so you kind of, I mean, I think if you're in a management role or a leadership role, I think that's like, that is the marker of whether you're successful is other people around you better than you? Because if they are, they're choosing to work with you, which is a massive deal, right? Because in the organizations I work with, or I run, or whatever, I find that where people are incredibly talented, they have choices, right? They're not coming to work with us because for one reason or other. They're coming to work because they passionately believe in what we're doing, and they have enormous amounts of choices about where they can go and do work and what they can go and do. But they choose to spend their time and their life with us. And I think that's where being like someone who is focused on learning as part of that is important, because often the best people themselves, whilst they may be the best at what they do in this bit, they're also looking constantly at how they can absorb new information, experience, learn how to develop. I think that's true. I'm sure that's true. I mean, you look at Bill Gates when he talks about things, he's clearly someone that is like absorbing information all the time. Yeah. He's not someone that has given up and says, I'm a billionaire, great, right? He's like constantly trying to work out what's next.
Every day is a skill day. You can always learn more. You can always stretch yourself and improve your knowledge. Yeah.
So I think that's the key, is that it's that thirst and hunger for more information, the hunger for learning and how to develop and make whatever you're doing better. I think that's the fundamental kind of facet, I think, of leadership anyway. But I think it's a fundamental facet of being a learning leader as well.
Skills we all have to foster more. So we like to end these with a little bit of a wild card question. So healthcare learning and training that we've spoke about so far, it is in transition. We look historically about the sort of digitization of training, but we're now moving into real digital transformation of training. So thinking of things like simulation training, use of VR and things like that there. So for you, what do you see as the future of healthcare learning, and what perhaps are some of the challenges ahead for those healthcare training departments as they try to change?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's an interesting one. What I've seen is there's a major infrastructure issue, right? So we're so used to, you probably have seen this as well. Tell me if I'm wrong on this, but I've seen where there's a lot of we've created really excellent infrastructure in the UK into kind of office spaces, right? And so you like just being on the internet is very easy when you go to your office, because you build big pipelines in, and you're doing a lot of this stuff. But like I'm finding in the teams I'm working with, both in our organizations but also externally, that we don't have a uniform infrastructure across the country, where you're suddenly taking up a lot of bandwidth on things and people don't have like great connection. And I think one of the things that I'm certainly seeing is that I think we all as a society have to really focus on that, because if we're going to really use technology, we need to basically have that. And I think at an organizational level, we're certainly seeing that we're starting to plan for improving how our teams actually can benefit from technology. So can they work in this way at home, and what can we do to support them doing that? Because they clearly enjoy it and they're clearly more efficient at it, but there are certain things that we as an organization should do to facilitate that. So for instance, providing them with better technology to use at home, and actually even sometimes just augmenting their ability to get better band connections, right? But like if we're expecting them to do things, then we should upgrade their home connections for them, or if they can't afford to, whatever, that kind of thing becomes a core business activity. I think things like that we need to focus on as a society. And I think all commercial and public sector organizations need to really think about that, because this experience has been a very interesting learning experience for all of us about what things work. I think in other ways it is about embedding some of the things that have happened over the last few months. Like, I think we've got such a great opportunity to take what has been such a negative occurrence for society, but actually try and learn lessons from it, and try and make the best of the situation in some ways, in terms of understanding that we as a society, that if you look at most people, people are generally quite kind. They're quite good to their neighbours. They're trying their best to keep within the rules and stuff. They're not, people are, I don't hear, I mean, maybe I'm wrong, but I don't hear people just flouting things. People care about the societies they're in. And I think that speaks volumes about humans as a group, right? And so now what we have to do is look at what's happened and really try and learn from that and make the most of what the positives were. And as organizations, my organization, your organizations, we all have to then support the people within the organization to do well. And I think that's the big thing I'll take away.
Brilliant. Well, thank you so much for your time today, Johann. It's been really interesting to catch up with you and have a chat through some of those things. I'm sure everyone listening will agree there's been lots of little nuggets just dropped throughout the conversation that have been really helpful and be really interesting for people. For those of you watching, thank you so much for joining us today on this, our latest Learning Leaders series. You can find more episodes on our social channels.